There are still today many of the most evil dictators of the Second World War, buried inside tombs or graves that exist on Earth. There has been a huge amount of speculation in the years following the conflict about the true location of Hitler's remains, or what happened to him as Berlin crumbled around him under the intense bombardment of the Soviet Red Army. There have been many theories put forward that Hitler's ashes may still exist in some form today, being smuggled away by the leader of the Hitler Youth, a man who grew close to the dictator in his final days, and that still inside of a Soviet archive there may be pieces of the former dictator of the Third Reich packed away inside evidence boxes. But there were many other dictators throughout the Second World War who either allied themselves with the Nazis or they fought tooth and nail against them. Some of these men were collaborators, and they were later brought to justice for the fact they sold their own people out to the Nazis, and they did face the ultimate consequence for this. The dictators of the Second World War had different political beliefs, but they were all rather ruthless men who would not take any nonsense. For example, Stalin even ordered a command for his soldiers to not take a single step back, and there were execution squads who were told to shoot their own men if they offered any form of retreat. But these men would all meet their ends and deaths in different ways and manners, and they are commemorated and remembered in diverse ways. Some were given large tombs, and some had their bodies thrown into rough graves where they were then forgotten about, a symbol of the brutalism of their regime and how well they were liked by their people. In this video we look at the graves and tombs of the World War II dictators that still exist today, and we'll look at how these different men met their ends. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Benito Mussolini was the fascist dictator of Italy, and he seized control following his march on Rome in 1922, and he would be deposed in 1943 by his own government. Mussolini's failings were caused mostly due to his close alliance with Adolf Hitler, and he brought his nation into the Second World War, and his forces were not as effective as he dreamed. Mussolini wanted to conquer different lands, but the reality was that thousands of Italian soldiers were killed fighting the British and other allied nations, and many inside of Italy believed that they were fighting a war which no one wanted to be involved in. The war cost the Italians a huge amount of resources, and earlier conflicts also left it struggling. Mussolini, regardless of this, threw his nation into the conflict on the side of the Germans, and he dreamed of he and Hitler having huge empires, having conquered many different territories. He was deposed as the head of government, being turned on by those inside his own cabinet, and Mussolini in 1943 was locked up in prison. He was then rescued in the Grand Sasso raid by German commandos led by Otto Skorzeny, upon the orders of Hitler. Hitler then, after Mussolini was freed, placed the Italian dictator in control of the Nazi puppet state in the north of Italy, known as the Italian Social Republic. This was a collaborationist regime, but as the Allies landed and pushed throughout Italy, Mussolini realised that the net was closing on him, and also that the Italian partisans were beginning to hunt down different prominent fascists and former members of the government. Mussolini was captured whilst trying to escape Italy, and he was on a Luftwaffe convoy heading towards Germany to reunite with Adolf Hitler. He had previously tried to get out of the country, but had been denied. After his arrest, his execution was ordered, and he was then shot alongside his mistress Clara Petacci on the 28th of April 1945, their bodies being littered by machine gun bullets. But their ordeal was not over. The remains of Mussolini and Petacci were taken to a public square in Milan, where they were brutalised and battered by the large crowds who flocked to take out their anger upon the remains of Mussolini. One reporter witnessed the chaos and wrote, "While I watched, a civilian trampled across the bodies and dealt Mussolini's shaven head a terrific kick. Someone pushed the twisted head into a more natural position again with a rifle butt. Although Mussolini's upper teeth now protruded grotesquely, there was no mistaking his jaw. In death Mussolini seemed a little man. He wore a fascist militia uniform, grey breeches with a narrow black stripe, a green-grey tunic and muddy black riding boots. A bullet had pierced his skull over the left eye and emerged at the back, leaving a hole from which his brains dripped. Mistress Petacci, 25-year-old daughter of an ambitious Roman family, and also Mussolini's mistress, wore a white silk blouse. On her breast were 2 bullet holes ringed by dark circles of dried blood. The mob surged and swayed around the grisly spot. One woman emptied a pistol into Mussolini's body. 5 shots, she screamed. 5 shots for my 5 murdered sons. Others cried, he died too quickly, he should have suffered. But the hate of many was wordless, they could only spit. The bodies were then strung upside down from a half-built service station, and Mussolini's remains would then be taken by the American army, who arrived in the square in the afternoon of the 29th of April 1945. They autopsied the remains, and then buried the body of Benito Mussolini first in a grave inside the Musocca cemetery in Milan. He was buried in an unmarked grave, but in April 1946 he was exhumed by a fascist journalist and his friends, and over 16 weeks the body of Mussolini was moved from place to place, and it was then tracked down to a monastery, and 2 friars were involved also in hiding the body. The corpse of Mussolini was then left inside of a Capuchin monastery for 11 years, and the whereabouts of his remains were kept secret, and his family were not even informed about this. But then on the 1st of September 1957, Mussolini's body was buried inside of the Mussolini family crypt, and within a tomb, and this tomb is visited by thousands of people today, and many neo-fascists arrive on the anniversary of his death and hold rallies around the tomb. It is decorated with fascist symbols, and there is also a large bust of Mussolini above. To the side there are a number of containers, and one of these actually contains slices of his brain that had been taken by the Americans during the autopsy. But inside the tomb there is also another twist, as the body of Mussolini that is there today is missing a leg, this having been taken when he was exhumed, and his leg has still not been found. Joseph Stalin was the powerful and ruthless dictator of the Soviet Union, and he was in power for many decades. He led the Union from 1924 until he died in 1953, and his reign was seen as one which was associated with huge purges and executions of the population, and also with ruthlessness. During the Second World War, Stalin saw the Soviet Union invaded during Operation Barbarossa, and despite previously signing a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, Hitler broke this, and he turned upon Stalin and rampaged his forces into Stalin's lands. The Eastern Front, which opened up, was the deadliest theatre of the conflict, and Stalin threw millions of people, men and women, into the fighting, and a huge amount of death took place within his Red Army. The Soviets did manage to repel the Germans, and they did take control after the Battle of Stalingrad, and also managed to lift the siege of Leningrad, but Stalin would then meet with Churchill and Roosevelt to discuss the post-war dismantling of Nazism. Stalin was, during the conflict, impatient with the Americans and British, and in 1944 the Red Army pushed throughout Europe towards Germany, and these huge offensives smashed the German army and pushed the remaining forces back towards Berlin and the heart of the Reich. The Red Army did seize Berlin, and whilst it was smashing artillery on the city, Hitler died inside of his Führer bunker, and then in May 1945 Germany did surrender. Stalin had wanted Hitler to be captured alive, but he had his remains allegedly taken to Moscow. But Stalin's forces were involved in huge assaulting campaigns, looting and slaughter on a mass scale. After the conflict, Stalin was at the height of his popularity and power, and the USSR became a dominant force alongside the US, and the tensions between the two nations led to the Cold War. In his final years, his health began to fail, and he would spend longer away from the limelight and on holiday. He remained ruthless though, ordering a number of doctors in 1952 to be tortured for allegedly plotting to kill senior politicians. From 1946 until his death, Stalin would only give 3 speeches, with 2 of them just lasting a matter of minutes. On the 1st of March 1953, Stalin's staff burst into the room of his dacha, and he was found drifting in and out of consciousness. He was given different medications and injections, but things continued to get worse, and he died on the 5th of March 1953. His death was announced the following day, and his body was heavily embalmed, and it was then displayed inside of the House of Unions in Moscow for 3 days, where thousands of people piled in to witness the remains of the dictator. There was such disorganisation upon viewing the body that there was a huge crush, and many died from this. Stalin's funeral took place on the 9th of March, and it was attended by hundreds of thousands. To begin with, Joseph Stalin was interred inside of Lenin's mausoleum, and his embalmed body shared a spot on public display next to Vladimir Lenin's from 1953 to 1961. But there was a decision then made during the de-Stalinization process and Khrushchev's fall to move Stalin's body and to then inter him in a proper tomb and grave under the ground, bringing his remains off public display. On the 31st of October 1961, Lenin's mausoleum was covered in plywood to protect people from seeing what was happening inside, and then Stalin's remains were interred in a deep grave at the Kremlin wall necropolis. His grave was very deep and was lined with concrete blocks, and the ceremony was attended upon by very few. It was claimed that everyone was so curious to see the new grave of Stalin. Unlike others, Stalin's was not yet graced with a bust and only a tablet with the name Joseph Stalin and dates of birth and death. Today Stalin is still interred within this tomb. Emperor Hirohito was the longest reigning Japanese emperor, and he was in control of the nation for 62 years. Throughout his time in power, there was a huge amount of Japanese expansion and militarization, and the nation would aim to build a huge Asian empire. He also oversaw the involvement of the nation in the Second Sino-Japanese War, and also, of course, World War II. Hirohito became the emperor following his father's death in 1926, and served as the head of state during many brutal campaigns carried out by the Japanese forces. He formally sanctioned the Japanese to go to war with the Americans and their allies, and a week later the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor and further Allied colonies in Southeast Asia. His forces were incredibly loyal to him, and they were willing to give their life for their emperor, and they would do anything for him, including crashing Japanese kamikaze planes into Allied ships and vessels with no chance of survival. He was in no uncertain terms a warmonger, but he did know that the war was turning badly for the Japanese in 1945, and following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hirohito informed the imperial family of his decision to surrender. Hirohito's surrender broadcast claimed, "The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it would also lead to the total extinction of human civilization." There were many who thought Hirohito should have been brought to a trial as a Class A war criminal, the most serious, but General Douglas MacArthur, the general in charge of the Pacific, thought that this would bring more trouble, and that the Japanese would become more hostile to the Americans, who were occupying the nation. He had a pivotal role in the Second World War, and was forced to acknowledge publicly that he was not an incarnate divinity, and that Hirohito did not have divine powers over the nation. For the remaining years of his life, Hirohito performed many duties that would be expected of a constitutional head of state, for example opening new building projects, and he would also travel to different nations to visit other heads of state. In September 1987, Hirohito had surgery on his pancreas, and it was found that he did have cancer. He appeared to be making a good recovery, but a year later he collapsed in his palace, and his health then went downhill further. He suffered from constant internal bleeding, and at 6:33 a.m. on the 7th of January 1989, Emperor Hirohito died at the age of 87. His state funeral took place, and it was huge and colossal. Many world leaders attended the funeral, and he was then interred in the Musashi Imperial Graveyard for burial. He was interred in a huge tomb, and his burial was seen as the final interring of a World War II war leader. One of the most ruthless leaders of a Second World War nation was Ante Pavelic, who was the dictator of the independent state of Croatia, and this was a fascist puppet state based on Yugoslav lands and parts conquered by the Nazis and the fascist Italians. Pavelic used the horrific paramilitaries known as the Ustasha to enforce his racial policies, and many were persecuted under his leadership, and they were executed in some of the most horrific ways. The SS even saw some of the Ustasha's exploits and their methods of killing, and this was too much for them. He referred to himself as the Plagavnik, or the supreme leader, and took control of the Nazi puppet state. His policies brought the deaths of well over 100,000 Serbs and Jews, who were slaughtered inside concentration and extermination sites, and many more hundreds of thousands were tortured and were slaughtered in other ways. The persecutions led by Ante Pavelic's government have been described as the most disastrous episode in Yugoslav history. He also ordered the executions of some of his own politicians, and these were accused of attempting to oust him, and in the final days of the war, trying to ally the nation with the Allies. After the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945, Pavelic ordered his soldiers to continue to fight on against their enemies despite the surrender, and he ordered his government officials to surrender their armed forces to the advancing British and to then flee themselves to Austria. But the partisans, the resistance movement, intercepted large swathes of Pavelic's men, and they began to execute and kill many Ustasha members. But he knew that he would be a wanted war criminal, who would be hunted by many. Pavelic knew that if he fell into Allied hands, then he would be executed, most probably in his former lands after being handed over. He fled the nation and went to Italy, dressed and disguised as a priest with a Peruvian passport. He went through to Rome, and was sheltered by the Vatican, staying in some of the Vatican's houses. He also gathered some of his allies and he formed the Croatian State Committee, and he remained inside of Italy until he then decided to flee on to Argentina after he had heard that some were trying to arrest him. He got to Buenos Aires in November 1948 and worked as a security advisor to Argentinian President Juan Perón. He was given amnesty in the nation along with 34,000 other Croats, including many former Nazi collaborators. On the 10th of April 1957, Ante Pavelic was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt by a Serbian hotel owner and a former officer of the Royal Yugoslav Army. He shot Pavelic in the back and collarbone whilst he was exiting a bus, and he spent some time recovering. Pavelic travelled to Spain on the 29th of November 1957, and he was granted asylum there, but on the 28th of December 1959, he died at a hospital in Madrid, aged 70, from complications regarding the wounds he sustained in the assassination plot. Pavelic was then buried within a cemetery in Madrid, one of the oldest private burial grounds in the city, and his grave is public, and it carries his name, despite the fact he tried to live out for many years under false identities. His daughter allegedly even regularly visits the grave and places fresh flowers and candles on it. Jozef Tiso was a Slovak politician and a Catholic priest who served as the president of the First Slovak Republic, a puppet state of Nazi Germany during World War II. Tiso was at a young age introduced to the priesthood, and he helped to give aid to those who were in need in modern-day Slovakia. He joined the Slovak People's Party, and then later in 1938 became the party's leader. He made the Slovak Republic an independent country, and 2 days after Nazi Germany seized the remaining Czech lands, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was introduced. Tiso was the Prime Minister of autonomous Slovakia, and he became the Slovak Republic's Prime Minister and then President. Throughout the war, Tiso collaborated heavily with the Nazis in their brutal policies. He had thousands of Jewish people sent to concentration and extermination camps within Germany and German-occupied lands, and the deportations saw the deaths of thousands, most within minutes of arriving at the sites. Hitler and Tiso did have a direct confrontation at some point to continue to deport more Jewish people to be slaughtered, and most were sent to Auschwitz where they were then killed. Some were even murdered inside Slovakia in their own country. Tiso did continue in power during the occupation of the lands by the Germans, but his presidency was regulated, but by the end of the Holocaust, over 2/3 of Jewish people living in Slovakia had been murdered under his leadership. As the Soviet Red Army conquered the remaining parts of Western Slovakia in April 1945, Tiso went on the run, hiding inside of a Bavarian monastery. He was then extradited to Czechoslovakia to stand trial for his crimes, which included deporting thousands, awarding Nazi war criminals the prestigious Grand Cross, allowing military occupations of the land, establishing a totalitarian regime, terrorising thousands, stealing huge sums of money, giving money to the Nazis, and inciting hatred. There were many more charges, and for all of these, Tiso was sentenced to death. Inside Bratislava on the 18th of April 1947, he was executed, being hanged, and he wore his full clerical uniform for his date with the executioner. His body was then buried secretly to avoid his grave becoming a shrine, but some of Tiso's followers soon identified the specific grave plot for him, inside the St. Martin's Cemetery in Bratislava. DNA testing later confirmed that it was his remains, and he was later exhumed, and today is buried inside St. Emmeram's Cathedral in Nitra, his body still being there today. Ion Antonescu was a Romanian military official and marshal who rose to the position of the dictator during World War II. He was actually imprisoned by the king for his political beliefs, but he then rose to prominence, and following Romania becoming allied with Nazi Germany, he got rid of the Iron Guard, who he partnered up with, and he then served as a prime minister. Romania joined the Axis forces, and Romanian soldiers fought alongside German ones during the invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, and Antonescu then became the Marshal of Romania. During the conflict, his policies resulted in the slaughter of around 400,000 people, most of them being Bessarabian, Romanian and Ukrainian Jews, as well as the Romani. His regime conducted their own pogroms and slaughterous actions. Antonescu's forces conducted terrible war crimes too, and it's considered that Antonescu's Romania was second to the Nazis in terms of the sheer amount of anti-Semitic extermination. There were also many political prisoners who were locked up inside of prisons. Large-scale Allied bombing did take place over Bucharest in 1944, and the Red Army would approach the borders. There were attempts by the Romanians to hold out, but Antonescu made one final visit to Hitler in early August 1944, and Antonescu was then overthrown. He was asked to take Romania out of the Axis alliance and refused to do this, and was arrested and was replaced. In May 1946, after a number of years of interrogation and imprisonment, Ion Antonescu was brought to the People's Tribunal and was accused of war crimes, crimes against peace and treason. These tribunals were comparable to the Nuremberg trials in Allied-occupied Germany, and he was found guilty of all the charges. He tried to appeal, but was sentenced to death, and he would be executed by a firing squad. Antonescu was given a soldier's death, and his execution took place on the 1st of June 1946. He did refuse to wear a blindfold and raise his hat in salute as the order to fire was given. Ion Antonescu was actually not buried, and today there is no grave for him that can be found. His body following execution was brought to a local crematorium, where it was reduced to ashes, and the ashes were then scattered close to the site of execution, near to Ilhava prison. His grave is one of the only ones, alongside Hitler, belonging to a World War II dictator, that cannot be viewed today. At the end of the Second World War, many of the men who had ruthlessly overseen their countries and established a tough dictatorship had very varied ends. Some managed to live out their lives in exile, and others were brought to their execution. Some did seemingly escape any form of punishment, for example Emperor Hirohito, who was considered a serious warmonger and a criminal. But still today the graves of many of these men, who caused a huge amount of suffering and death, can still be seen. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.